For most of human history, people drank alcohol with nearly every meal. Water was dangerous. Beer was safe. But this meant that for centuries, humanity was slightly intoxicated for most of their waking hours. Then, in the span of just a few decades, everything changed. A single drink transformed human consciousness, helped create the modern world, and sparked political upheavals. What connects beer, the birth of modern science, and political revolutions? The answer might surprise you. This is the story of coffee. Hi, welcome to another episode of Threads of Civilization. Coffee had arrived in Europe by the 1600s. Within a century, it would accelerate the scientific revolution, birth democratic ideals, and help overthrow monarchies. Coffeehouses became known as penny universities, places where, for the price of a cup, anyone could engage in intellectual discourse. Religious leaders called coffee the devil's drink. Kings tried to ban them, but they couldn't stop what was coming. Little did anyone know, this bitter black beverage would do more than just wake people up. It would wake up entire civilizations. The question is, how did a simple drink change the course of human history? The story begins in the Ethiopian highlands around the year 850. According to legend, a goat herder named Kaldi noticed his goats behaving strangely. They were dancing. Yes, that's right, dancing goats. After eating berries from a particular tree, the animals became energetic and refused to sleep at night. Kaldi took the berries to a local monastery. The monks, initially skeptical, threw the berries into a fire, declaring them the devil's work. But as the beans roasted, an intoxicating aroma filled the room. The monks retrieved the roasted beans from the flames, ground them, and mixed them with hot water. They had discovered something remarkable. The monks found they could stay awake through long hours of evening prayer. Word spread through the religious community. Coffee? Cultivation had spread across the Arabian Peninsula by the 1400s. Sufi monks in Yemen used coffee in religious ceremonies, believing it helped them achieve spiritual focus during their all-night devotions. Here's where things get interesting. The port city of Mocha in Yemen became the world's first coffee export hub. Arab traders closely guarded their monopoly. They would parch or boil the beans before export to ensure they couldn't be planted elsewhere. It was a trade secret worth protecting. Coffee was bringing enormous wealth to the region. Coffee had reached Istanbul, Cairo, and Mecca by the early 1500s. The first coffeehouses opened in Constantinople around 1555. These weren't just places to drink. They became centers of social life, places where men gathered to debate politics, discuss literature, listen to music, and play chess. The Ottoman authorities immediately recognized the danger. The governor of Mecca, Khair Beg, declared coffee illegal in 1511. He claimed it stimulated radical thinking and was concerned about people gathering in coffeehouses to criticize his rule. The ban didn't last. The Sultan in Cairo, himself a coffee drinker, overruled the order. Coffee was here to stay. At this stage, Europe was still drinking beer for breakfast. Water sources in cities were contaminated with waste. Mild alcoholic beverages were the safe choice. People started their day with small beer, a weak brew with just enough alcohol to kill bacteria, but not enough to cause serious intoxication. Still, it meant that most Europeans were functioning in a slightly dulled mental state for most of their waking hours. This would soon change. Coffee arrived in Europe through Venetian merchants around 1615. The Catholic Church initially condemned it as the bitter invention of Satan, a Muslim drink that threatened Christian values. The story goes that Pope Clement VIII was asked to ban coffee outright. Instead, he decided to taste it first. After taking a sip, he declared, quote, This Satan's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it." End quote. He baptized the beverage on the spot, making it acceptable for Christians to consume. Coffeehouses had begun opening across major European cities by the 1650s. Oxford's first coffeehouse opened in 1650. London's first opened in 1652, established by a Greek entrepreneur named Pasqua Rosé. London had more than 80 coffeehouses within a decade. And herein lies the revolution. These weren't taverns. The atmosphere was completely different. While alehouses were rowdy and often violent, coffeehouses were civil. Men came to exchange information, discuss philosophy, and read newspapers. Ship captains shared news from foreign ports. Merchants conducted business. Scientists debated new theories, all for the price of a penny per cup. To understand why this was so transformative, you need to know what coffee does to the brain. Coffee contains caffeine, a psychoactive compound that blocks adenosine receptors in your brain. Adenosine is what makes you feel tired. When caffeine blocks these receptors, dopamine and glutamate, which help with learning and alertness, can work more effectively. The result? Faster reaction times, increased focus, and improved short-term memory. In the right doses, caffeine enhances cognitive performance by about 10 to 15%. Think about that. For the first time in history, large numbers of people were spending their days in a state of enhanced mental clarity instead of mild intoxication. They were alert, focused, and gathered in spaces designed for intellectual exchange and conversation. The effects were staggering. London's coffeehouses developed reputations based on their clientele. Writers and poets met at Will's Coffeehouse. Scientists gathered at the Grecian Coffeehouse. Stock traders congregated at Jonathan's Coffeehouse, which would later become the London Stock Exchange. Lloyd's Coffeehouse, established in 1686, became the center for maritime insurance and eventually evolved into Lloyd's of London, still among the world's largest insurance markets today. Meanwhile, the coffeehouse was enabling something even more profound. At the Grecian Coffeehouse in London, the Royal Society held informal meetings. Members included Robert Hooke, Edmund Halley, and Isaac Newton. They would debate theories, share observations, and discuss experiments over cups of coffee. The scientific method itself was being refined in these spaces. The idea that knowledge should come from experimentation and observation rather than ancient authority. This was revolutionary thinking. Coffee arrived in Marseille in 1644 in France, brought by a merchant named Pierre de la Roque. Parisian cafes had become fashionable meeting places for intellectuals by the 1670s. Café Procope, which opened in 1686, became legendary. Its patrons included Voltaire, who allegedly drank 40 cups of coffee per day, Benjamin Franklin, Diderot, and Rousseau. These weren't just social gatherings. These were the meeting places of the Enlightenment. The ideas discussed in these coffeehouses would reshape Western civilization. Freedom of speech, democracy, human rights, scientific inquiry. These weren't abstract philosophical musings. They were practical discussions happening over coffee between men who would go on to change the world. But things were different now than in the Ottoman Empire. European authorities were watching nervously. King Charles II of England attempted to ban coffeehouses in 1675. His proclamation declared they were places where, quote, diverse, false, malicious, and scandalous reports are devised and spread abroad to the defamation of His Majesty's government, end quote. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. Charles was forced to revoke the ban just 11 days later. He had learned a crucial lesson. You cannot suppress the flow of ideas once people have tasted intellectual freedom. Coffee consumption was spreading across all social classes by this stage. What started as an exotic luxury for the wealthy had become accessible to common workers. This democratization of stimulants had profound implications. To make matters worse for the ruling classes, coffeehouses refused to observe traditional social hierarchies. In an era of rigid class distinctions, coffeehouses operated on a radical principle. All customers were equal. A duke might sit next to a clerk. Status came from the quality of your ideas, not your title. This was dangerous. Around the same time, coffee was crossing the Atlantic. The first coffeehouse in colonial America opened in Boston in 1676. Coffeehouses had appeared in Philadelphia, New York, and other colonial cities by the early 1700s. These American coffeehouses followed the English model. They were centers of political discussion, news, and commerce. What followed was perhaps inevitable. On December 16, 1773, a group of American colonists gathered at the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, but they weren't drinking beer. They were drinking coffee and planning what would become known as the Boston Tea Party. The Green Dragon was called the headquarters of the Revolution. John Adams, Paul Revere, and other founding fathers used it as their meeting place. When these same colonists dumped 342 chests of British tea into Boston Harbor, they weren't just protesting taxes. They were rejecting tea itself, the drink of the British Empire. Coffee became the patriotic alternative. Thomas Jefferson called it, quote, the favorite drink of the civilized world, end quote. The American Revolution had found its beverage. Coffee consumption in America exploded after the Revolution. It became part of American identity, a symbol of independence from British rule. Drinking coffee was an act of patriotism. But the most dramatic coffeehouse revolution was still to come. In Paris, the Café de Foix in the Palais Royal was the most fashionable gathering place for political radicals and young intellectuals. On July 12, 1789, a young journalist named Camille Desmoulins stood on a table at the Café de Foix. He pulled out 2 pistols, brandished them in the air, and shouted for citizens to take up arms. 2 days later, the Bastille fell. The French Revolution had begun in a coffeehouse. Throughout the revolutionary period, Parisian cafés served as headquarters for different political factions. The Café de Foix remained a gathering place for radicals. The Café Corazza was known for royalist sympathizers. Café Procope hosted the Jacobins. Robespierre himself was a regular customer. These weren't just meeting places. They were the infrastructure of revolution. In these cafés, revolutionaries planned insurrections, debated political theory, and read pamphlets. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, the foundational document of human rights, drew heavily from ideas discussed in these coffee-soaked spaces. The concepts of fraternity, equality, and liberty weren't born in universities or royal courts. They were refined over countless cups of coffee by people who had been given the mental clarity to imagine a different world. Incredibly, this pattern repeated across Europe. In Vienna, coffeehouses became centers of intellectual and artistic life. In the 19th century, they would host the conversations that led to modern physics, psychoanalysis, and new forms of literature and music. Sigmund Freud developed many of his theories while sitting in Viennese cafes. The pattern was clear. Wherever coffeehouses flourished, new ideas followed. Coffee had become essential to the Industrial Revolution by the 1800s. Factory workers needed to stay alert during 12-hour shifts. Office workers needed focus for repetitive tasks. Coffee was no longer just a social beverage or a luxury. It was the fuel of industrial capitalism. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Much of this coffee was produced by enslaved people in South American and Caribbean plantations. The drink that helped Europeans imagine equality and freedom was harvested by people who had neither. It was a brutal irony. Brazil became the world's largest coffee producer in the 1800s, a position it still holds today. The coffee industry there relied heavily on slave labor until Brazil abolished slavery in 1888, the last country in the Americas to do so. Millions of enslaved Africans had their lives consumed by coffee production. The revolution coffee sparked in Europe came at an enormous human cost elsewhere. What can we learn from the story of coffee? First, technology isn't always mechanical or digital. Sometimes the most transformative technologies are chemical. Coffee changed human consciousness before it changed anything else. By allowing people to remain alert for longer periods and think more clearly, it fundamentally altered what humans could accomplish. Second, spaces matter as much as substances. Coffee alone didn't cause revolutions. Coffeehouses did. These were the first truly public spaces where people from different social classes could gather as equals and exchange ideas freely. The architecture of democracy was built in coffeehouses. Third, every revolution has hidden costs. While coffee enabled European freedom and enlightenment, it also drove one of history's most brutal systems of forced labor. The same drink that symbolized liberty for some meant slavery for others. Coffee is the world's second most traded commodity after oil today. Over 2 billion cups are consumed every day. The modern world runs on coffee. From university libraries during exam week to Wall Street trading floors to Silicon Valley startups. In many ways, we're still living through the coffee revolution that began 4 centuries ago. The same beverage that helped overthrow monarchies now fuels the 24-hour global economy. The coffeehouses where revolutionaries once plotted now host freelancers on laptops building the next wave of technological change. Coffee didn't just fuel revolutions, it continues to fuel the accelerating pace of modern life. For better or worse, we're all participants in an experiment that started when Ethiopian goats ate some berries and started dancing. The question is, what would our world look like if coffee had never been discovered? Would we still be drinking beer for breakfast? Would democracy have taken root in the same way? Would the Enlightenment have happened? We'll never know. But one thing is certain. This bitter black beverage changed everything. So the next time you drink your morning coffee, remember, you're not just waking yourself up. You're participating in a ritual that helped create the modern world for all its contradictions and all its brilliance. All right, that's the story of coffee and revolution. If you found this interesting, I'd recommend checking out my videos on steel and the mirror. Both fascinating stories about how simple inventions changed civilization. So that's it from me. Feel free to discuss your thoughts below. I'm curious what coffee means to you, and whether you think we could have had modern civilization without it. Anyway, you've been watching Threads of Civilization. Cheers, guys. Have a good one.